So if we could please just do a quick round in the room, if you would just share your name, your agency, or even university affiliation, and where you're joining in from around the world. And then any sort of burning questions you have about the topic today. I know some of you did share on the registration some specific pieces that you'd be interested in covering, so I did share those with Dr. Field. But if we could just do a quick round here, Allison, I'll ask you to start. Just your name, university affiliation, and any burning questions you have in the moment.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Leatherman, and I'm in Portland, Oregon. And I am a professional school counselor in a high school and a doctoral student at Oregon State University. And prior to our time together today, I did, Dr. Tom, look at your website about your the research you're developing around, neuroscience and counseling and cognitive behavioral therapy. And so I'm just looking forward to hearing more about how you started that process, how you gathered your collaborators, and maybe kind of just that process of establishing that opportunity.
That sounds great. I'm taking notes as we are talking, Allison, so that I can try to touch on what you identify as we go.
Great, terrific, thank you.
Whoever wants to jump in next, by all means.
I'll go.
Oh, never mind.
Can I go?
Yeah.
Hi everyone. Good to see some of you again after a long break. I am checking in from Phoenix, Arizona. I am a doctoral student at Oregon State, like I'm Allison's classmate. And I also have had Tom as an instructor in my master's program, and Gideon was also a part of that master's program, in videos, and it was nice to see you personally in Portland. I'm excited to be here and to just learn. So no pressing questions as of now.
It's great to see you again, then, Tina.
I'll go next.
Great. Yeah, by all means, feel free.
Yeah, I'm trying to, I don't know if I'm on or not. My name is Lewis Downs. I graduated from Oregon State University with my PhD. I'm a professor emeritus from Cal State Sacramento, recently retired from University Brunei Dar es Salaam on the island of Borneo. Living in Albuquerque, I'm an international consultant on disaster mental health relief and have set up teams in China and Indonesia and Thailand and interface with Thailand to help them to do school-based trauma after the big tsunami of 2004. I no longer am active in university service per se, but do a lot of the international consultation. And reason why I joined the seminar was because it's become very discouraging to try to publish, particularly through the American Counseling Association, but inside the United States, because whenever I presented any of the disaster-related research that we've done with a multinational team, I've gotten very caustic remarks from supposed scholars and editing staff, and been rejected by journals in the US for things that they considered incendiary against the American Psychiatric Association, simply by comparing models and finding reduction in PTSD rates simply by switching from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5 and those kinds of things. And finding that editors-in-chief, particularly ACA, tend to accept the word of one of their three editors, that I should be rejected when the other two accept. I find this rather discouraging that there seems to be this closed club in the United States. And so I've had to publish most of my recent stuff abroad, even though it's really critical to the field, particularly in the United States, where PTSD is running rampant in soldiers, and that the DSM-5 closes the door to 25% of those who would have been diagnosed under the DSM-4. So that's my motivation for jumping in and getting some feedback and just some chat from other people who are researching in the field.
Thanks, Lewis. Yeah, thank you for sharing your experiences with us. I've got down some notes about things that I can weave in from what you want to discuss.
Great. Other folks want to jump in here? Yeah, Lisa.
Can you hear me? Hey, hello. My name is Lisa Lucas. I'm also a doctoral student at Oregon State University and a professional school counselor. And similar to Alan, Allison, I'm interested in the neural work. But again, I'd just like to be able to hear from you and see what else I can learn today. So thank you.
For sure.
I'll jump in since no one's going. Good morning. My name is Daniel Cisneros, and I'm here in Sacramento. So it's cool to hear. I heard about Dr. Downs at Sac State, and everybody's like, "You didn't have him?" I think he left right before I did my master's. But yeah, I'm here in Sacramento, and I'm a professional school counselor and a mental health counselor here in Sacramento, first year PhD student. I'm excited to be here. I don't have any burning questions yet, but I'm sure as we listen, things will come up. So good morning.
Good morning. And Lewis, I think you may have missed that, but Daniel was saying he did his master's degree at Sac State, and he thinks that you had retired just before he started. But
yeah, I recognize his name.
Oh.
Yeah, because I actually, everybody would talk about you. They're like, "You didn't have Dr. Downs," and I'm like, "No." So they were mentioning good things, but I must have just missed you when I did mine.
Well, nice to meet you finally.
Yeah, you too.
Okay, I guess I can go next. Please don't fool by the name that it shows. I was not able to log off the last person, so but my name is Julia Kanawasi. I'm also a doctorate student candidate at Oregon State. I'm from San Diego. I'm here in San Diego, and I actually work with veterans who are suffering from substance use disorder at the VA, as well as a residential rehabilitation center here in San Diego. So that's me. I don't have any burning questions at the moment, but I'm sure something will come up. And thanks.
Thanks, Julia, for clarifying your name as well. That's helpful.
Thanks.
I realize that comes to me. So hi, everyone. I'm Christian Chan. I'm an assistant professor of counseling at Idaho State University. Just thinking about burning questions, I can't think of particular questions per se, but in this particular, regarding the webinar topic, I'm really particularly interested in hearing more about the scholar leader model and how we really tie our work effectively together in terms of service leadership and research. So just really excited to be here to listen, to learn from the narrative and participate. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Christian. When I saw you log on, I was like, Christian could do this. It would probably, it would probably be even better. Christian is amazing. If you haven't followed his work, some of the stuff he's coming out with is fantastic. So it's an honor for you to be here, Christian.
Amazing. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. Let me just jump in here and introduce Dr. Field. Then I'll turn this over to him. Dr. Tom Field, as some of you know, is an assistant professor in the mental health counseling and behavioral medicine program at the Department of Psychiatry at Boston University School of Medicine. He has worked as a counselor educator since 2011. And he also currently sees clients in private practice. Since 2006, Dr. Field has worked with over 1,000 clients in a variety of settings, including schools, inpatient psychiatric units, and outpatient private practice. He received his PhD in counseling and supervision from James Madison University. And in 2019, he received the Linda Seligman Counselor Educator of the Year Award from the American Mental Health Counselors Association. His primary areas of research, as some of you are aware, are the integration of neuroscience into counseling practice and professional advocacy issues. He currently serves as the associate editor for the Journal of Mental Health Counseling, the co-editor of Counseling Today's Neurocounseling column, and is chair of both the AMCA Neuroscience Interest Network and the Neuroscience Task Force. So I know, as many of you, I am super excited to have him here today just to speak and share himself and his scholarship. So join me in welcoming Dr. Field.
Thank you all. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. So what I'd like to do to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to get into is I have a PowerPoint prepared. And I'm going to be kind of going over some of the information so you have a general understanding of the history of doctoral programs in counseling and also in allied fields that we've learned from. And then we'll move into the learning about the scholar leader model. And I know that you will have a lot of questions about my background as well, and anything from how do you publish, how do you work with teams, what's this neuroscience stuff you're into. So I'll weave some of that in, and feel free to ask questions about that as we go. And that's important for me to mention too, which is I like to be collaborative in how I present. It's the most boring thing ever to have someone just talk at you for an hour. So please post questions in the chat box, or you can just unmute yourself and ask a question at any time, and it'll make it a much more meaningful conversation. So please do that. Okay, let me share with you the presentation. We'll get started. Okay, can you all see that okay? Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the scholar leader model, as you know, for research and service. And as some of you mentioned, for example, Christian mentioned the integration of those, how do those work together well? And so we'll talk a lot about that as we go. I also wanted to mention that I am the past president of the Western region of ACES, or of WACES. And so I'll talk a little bit, as well as a state chapter president in the West. So I'll talk a little bit about regional issues, since my doctoral program was in the South. I worked for 5 years in the West in leadership roles, and now I'm in the Northeast. So I think that's important too, because you'll get a sense for how doctoral programs look different, and how scholar leadership looks different in different regions. Okay, so let's start working through the presentation together. Okay, so the 3 learning objectives Gideon already went over very briefly. We're going to look at the various models for conceptualizing work as doctoral level professionals. We'll look at the relevance of the scholar leader model to your own work and orientation, which I think is important, because as we'll look at, the identity of counselors is very important. And the question is, how does that play into the work you do as a doctoral level professional? And so we'll talk a lot about scholar leader and how that fits with the identity of counseling. Then we'll discuss the relationship between research and service, and the interplay, the interface, the integration. All right, so there are 3 main topic areas I'm going to cover to address those learning outcomes. The first is I'll look at models of doctoral training in the allied mental health professions. I think you have to begin there to understand how we have developed the doctoral program models that we have currently. We'll also look at the outcomes of CES doctoral programs, and that's important because if you look at scholar leadership, and how people basically use their doctorate when they graduate, it's important to look at what people are doing and what are the current statistics around doctoral graduates. Then we'll take a look at the scholar leader model, which will kind of emerge from the earlier models, as you'll see. All right, let's start with models of doctoral training in allied mental health professions. Let's start talking about the scientist practitioner model, which was the first model in the mental health fields that was identified for doctoral study. This came out of psychology. In fact, the first several models came out of psychology. And as many of you are probably aware of from our history, we borrowed a lot from psychology. So a lot of counselor educators will use this phrase, scientist practitioner, in their own as part of their own identity and their program's identity. You know, we train scientists, practitioners, and it comes from psychology. In 1949, the APA convened, this is American Psychological Association, convened their Boulder conference in Colorado, where they basically wanted to determine what the standards were for doctoral training in psychology. This is basically the APA version of CACREP. This is the beginnings of that for psychology. And as part of that, they talked about what would be required for a doctoral graduate. And they identified at the time you needed to have a PhD in psychology from a university-based program. So you couldn't do it, for example, at a high-level clinic. You needed to go through university. And you needed to have a 12-month internship as part of that. But this model has pretty much remained constant now since then. So if you look at most PhD programs in clinical or counseling psych, they have the same kind of flavor in terms of you need to have a PhD, or sometimes EdD is okay, from a university-based program with this internship requirement. And of course, the PsyD model is different, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Graduates should be competent in the scientist practitioner model in conducting research and providing professional services. So think about the title, scientist practitioner. Scientist is an important thing to look at. So we're talking here about conducting research in lab-based settings. When we think about scientists, you're looking at developing scientific experiments that you can then test. And those things happen in labs. So if you're going to have a doctoral program in psychology, you need access to labs, right, to have a scientist practitioner model. The word practitioner suggests that a person is going to go out and serve the public at the end of this, not just do research in labs. So there was a dual focus to that degree. This is important because in counselor education, very few labs exist. There are counseling clinics that exist in the community, but very few labs for experiments exist. So the scientist practitioner model has never been a great model for counselor ed, just because labs haven't been a fundamental part of our doctoral study and doctoral programs. And we'll talk about why that is in a minute. For example, why doctoral programs in counseling, while they haven't necessarily had a much of a focus on developing advanced practitioners, they have tried to develop researchers, but without labs. And so what does that look like and what are the outcomes? We'll get to that. For context, it's important to mention what happened subsequent to the Boulder conference in '49. Rogers came of age, if you will. He started publishing his major works right around the early 50s, 51. So this is how early the Boulder conference was. You know, the late 40s is very early in the mental health movement. DSM-1 was published in '52, to give you context. So the Boulder conference happened before DSM existed. The Community Mental Health Centers Act happened in '63, which is an important act that basically deinstitutionalized a lot of psychiatric facilities where people were housed for very long periods of time prior to this, and tried to serve them in the community through community mental health centers. Beck and Ellis arrived in the '60s, and of course, cognitive behavior therapy has become the predominant method of psychotherapy because of the evidence-based practice movement, which is another discussion I could have with you at another time. And then family systems theories started to emerge strongly in the '50s and '60s. So in other words, the Boulder model was important in that it existed before all of these things, and after that, all of these advances in clinical practice occurred. If you look at most of these things, these have to do with clinical practice, okay? And so as subsequent to that, the American Psychological Association realized they needed more programs that developed practitioners because there was more need for psychotherapy and more models are being developed that required people to have more advanced training, for example, in humanistic, family systems approaches, etc. Because prior to that, remember, it's really just psychodynamic therapy that existed, right? We didn't have even Rogers by '49. So the Vail conference in '73 was targeted to basically increase the amount of doctoral level practitioners in psychology. So this is where they developed their PsyD, which is doctorate in psychology rather than doctor of philosophy. And you had to have a PsyD from, again, a university-based program plus this 12-month internship. That was similar. The major difference was that graduates should be more competent in providing professional services and less so on conducting research. It was less essential. This is important because psychology at this point had identified that not all doctoral programs needed to be producing scientists, you know, and that you could have doctoral level practitioners in the mental health field that weren't necessarily scientists. That's important for us as we start looking at counselor ed models. They also developed a lesser known model, psychology did in the 1990s, called the clinical scientist model. So imagine the scientist practitioner model, right? And you take away the scientist for that, you're just really looking at practitioners. Well, this was like the other side. So you take away the practitioner and you're just looking at scientists, basically. This is really for people who a kind of model for people who are doing more lab-based research, who are then going to go and run labs in the future. And in this, you're looking at a PhD in psychology from a university-based program, same deal, same internship requirement. But your primary focus is conducting research, and professional services is less important. Now, this is also interesting to us in counseling, because counselor education programs, by and large, aren't focused on developing practitioners. And yet, we don't really have labs. And so this model isn't a perfect fit for us, but it kind of fits a bit more than certainly the scholar practitioner model does, because we don't develop advanced practitioners. And even the scientist practitioner model, because again, we don't develop practitioners. So it's almost like these three models don't fit entirely well. This clinical scientist is the closest, but it's nowhere near what we do because we don't have a lot of labs in counselor ed at the doctoral level. For context, there were things that happened in counseling subsequent to the Vail model. The Vail model, you remember, is the PsyD model. These are things that are also worth mentioning because counseling really came of age in the 70s and 80s in terms of professionalization. The first licensure law was passed in Virginia in 76. AMCA came of age in 76 as well, really as a response to help people who were basically getting licensed, to provide a place for them. Because remember, APGA before that, the American Personnel and Guidance Association, was focused on school counseling and on career and vocational counseling, because that's historically where our roots are. DSM-3 was 1980. DSM-3 is important because prior to DSM-3, you may be familiar with this, homosexuality was a mental disorder, and they removed it in DSM-3. And you start to see in DSM-3 more of a movement towards social justice and trying to advocate for people and do things like remove stigma of mental disorders for certain conditions. It's still an issue with things like gender dysphoria, which is in DSM-5, which is very controversial. But the reason I put that bullet in there is because the multicultural social justice movement really has roots fairly early in the 70s, though it really, I think, took off in the 80s and 90s. KCREP and NBCC, which are major organizations in counseling, were formed in the early 80s. And both of them emerged from ACA ACEs. They were designated as separate organizations, but they originated, believe it or not, in our national organization. And so in addition, APGA, American Personnel Guidance Association, transformed into AACD, which is American Association of Counseling and Development, and eventually ACA, American Counseling Association. This is important because ACA recognized the growing amount of clinical counselors that were members, not just school and career and vocational counselors, and so wanted to represent all of those counselors. Again, this is important because you tend to see in doctoral programs more and more entry of clinicians into doctoral study rather than just school and vocational counselors, which was our history before. And this is important when we start talking about what kind of research are we doing. For example, doing school counseling labs is very difficult. I mean, you can do that kind of work, but it's complicated because you typically don't have schools on campus, whereas clinical labs are a different animal. And we really did not begin with the model of clinical labs in counseling because of the history and roots of counseling. The multicultural counseling movement began, I would say, to really take off in the 80s, and continues to be gathering steam now. A lot of the seminal work around, for example, multicultural counseling competencies that were developed in the 90s. And in 2015, of course, they had the integration of multicultural social justice counseling competence. So you see in the 80s up to now, there's been a kind of this proliferation of standards and focus on getting counselors more multiculturally and social justice oriented competent. By the late 2000s, early 2010s, We had a licensure in all 50 states in counseling. This is also an important marker for us because, again, you have more and more clinicians entering the field to the extent that now KCREP there are more students in clinical mental health counseling programs than in school counseling programs, which was not the case until fairly recently. And so you see more and more of a proliferation of clinicians in the counseling profession, more so than school counselors, which is changing a little bit of our identity in a way, and in a way that some people find very concerning. We'll talk about the mental health models that are concerning to counselors as we move on. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about psychology and the models that emerge from psychology. I'm going to talk next about the history of doctoral education in counseling, specifically counselor education. A lot of this information I have taken from existing research articles. One of them is by Atkinson Bradley. It's a very helpful article to read if you have time after this webinar. So Atkinson Bradley basically said that there were two major things that spurred the development of doctoral programs in counseling, two major events. The first was the National Defense Education Act, which if you're a school counselor, you're probably very familiar with. This one basically started to establish a lot of school counseling programs because of the space race, and they wanted school counselors to be funneling people into STEM fields. And the federal government gave quite substantial fellowships at the time to for students who entered into guidance counseling programs. They were giving what today is worth about $25,000 a year to become a school guidance counselor. So there was a large focus on developing that. And so you started to see more doctoral programs develop in order to train those school counselors. In addition, the Community Mental Health Center Act, which I've talked about, really generated this need for clinicians in the community. And that's where mental health counselors started to come into play. And now, following that, you see more of an interest at the doctoral level in helping to prepare and develop clinicians, in addition to school guidance counselors and career counselors. Now, what's interesting is that the way that we've conceptualized doctoral programs has changed over time. At the beginning of doctoral programs, we tended to think of this as they weren't fundamentally about preparing researchers, and research identity wasn't as crucial. It was more about helping to prepare people who are going to teach and supervise the master's level practitioners. So for example, when you look at advising loads, the KCREP standards have modified this substantially over time. They began in '88 with a max of 10 committees that an advisor could chair. Then it became 8 in '94, then 5 in 2001. And then in 2009, they nixed that, but then they said they have to be equivalent to comparable doctoral programs at the institution. This is important because some institutions have even less than 5, right? Because they're research institutions. Some have a lot more than 5 because they're more master's level institutions. And so it gave the freedom for the institutional characteristics, I guess, that the type of institution it is, to influence the way in which a doctoral program looks and feels. This is important because, as you'll see, there has been a growth in non-Carnegie classification 1 and 2. So by that I mean R1, R2, which you may be familiar with, research intensive and very high research intensive types of doctoral programs in counseling. And so you tend to see, even though most doctoral programs in counseling are R1 and R2s, and you'll see this in a minute, there are quite a few that are at different types of institutions now. And so the type of advising that you get in a dissertation is different, and it's going to feel less like a rigorous research preparation and more like more a mentored experience in conducting more applied research. And that's important because we're almost starting to see these two different models of research emerge within doctoral programs in counseling, if you look anecdotally at what programs are doing. Now, the 2009 standards were important for a couple of other reasons, and in many ways they're seen as being almost the, like this major transition for counselor education programs. They started talking in the 2009 standards about preparing future stewards of the discipline. That was the term they used, future stewards of the discipline. And they were interested in not only developing people who are going to do innovative research, but also who are going to take leadership roles in the counseling profession. So more overtly in 2009, KCREP started saying it's really a good thing if doctoral programs prepare leaders, not just researchers. In addition, the doctorate in CES in 2009, and actually as of 2013 was their requirement, you needed to have a doctorate in counselor education in order to become a faculty member in a KCREP master's program or KCREP program in general. This was a really important shift and has been very controversial. In fact, if you've been following CESNet over the years, there's been a lot of CESNet posts about this, which CESNet is a listserv for counselor education if you're not familiar. Because the history of our profession has been that counseling psych and counselor education have been quite closely connected. And this requirement basically differentiated counselor education formally and said you can't become a faculty member, full-time faculty member, a core faculty member in counselor education unless you have this doctorate that is from a counselor ed program. Now, this is important because we start to see, therefore, this need for models that are more specific for counselor education programs. Because previously, you could have people coming from counseling psych degrees, getting jobs in counselor ed, and their model of training is quite different than the traditional counselor ed model. And so there's a need for us to kind of continue to define doctoral programs in counseling and what we do. I wanted to mention some international pieces. I don't have a lot on international. I wish I had more, honestly, after seeing your feedback. But I have a little bit to share with you. It's interesting in that counseling and counselor education specifically is a United States discipline. If you look outside of the United States, their counselor education programs do not exist formally. So for example, in Western non-US countries, and by this I'm talking the UK, Canada, Australia, for example, they have doctoral degrees in counseling psychology, but they do not have doctoral degrees in counselor education. If you look at other countries, there are also a lack of doctoral standards in general for counselor education. For example, ERCEP, which is the KCREP variant that accredits international programs, does not have doctoral standards, period. And there's a good reason for that, because in a lot of other countries, you can become a practicing counselor without completing even a master's degree. There are a lot of countries have more certification programs, and they use also undergraduate degree preparation as primary routes for training counselors. So there isn't the same need for doctoral level counselor educators because there isn't this master's level requirement in the way that KCREP has it. Which is important for us to mention, because when we start talking about doctoral level practitioners, doctoral level professionals coming out of counselor ed, and we're really talking about the US model at this point in time. All right, so I've talked a bit about the history. I'm going to talk to you next about the outcomes of counselor ed doctoral programs. As of now, there are about 82 KCREP accredited programs in the United States. Of those 82 programs, they enroll about 3,000 students a year. Now just do the math for a second. If you were to divide 3,000 by 82, that's a massive amount of students. So the truth is, most of those programs are not big programs. If you look at the size of the incoming classes for those programs, most are pretty small. The typical size is about 6 to 10 students, 6 to 12 maybe a year at the max, okay? But there are some huge doctoral programs in counseling in addition to that. Most notably, some of the online programs, Capella, Walden, for example, have very large incoming classes. And so it's interesting that, that there's also this dynamic around where are those students coming from? And there's an unaddressed question in my mind about whether or not those programs are equivalently successful at helping students land various jobs. My concern is that there's a lot of stigma around online education. And so I would be very interested to see statistics on job placement rates for online versus in-person doctoral programs, and also to look at things like research publication and that scholarship once you've graduated from your program. So there's this interesting kind of elephant in the room when we talk about current doctoral level education, which is that the online game has been going on for a while, and it's really changing the amount of doctoral candidates that are being produced. We have about 500 graduates per year, and again, you divide that by 82, and that's a huge number. And that's not really representative of what most programs are producing. Most programs are producing, again, 6 to 12 graduates a year. So when you start looking at Carnegie classifications, it's interesting in terms of where are the doctoral programs in counselor ed. So the red here is R1, which is very, very research high, very research intensive. And examples of these kinds of institutions are, you know, everything from Harvard on, where they require a lot of research to be conducted in order to get tenure for and promotion as a faculty member. So, for example, you're expected to bring in grant money. Often you're expected to be publishing probably 3 to 4 articles a year, would be my guess at most R1s. And so that is important because faculty are very invested in research. And if you're a student at an R1 university, you tend to be doing more research with faculty and tend to get more training in research because that's the culture of the institution. And institutional culture, it is important. It has a large role in the kind of flavor of the doctoral program at the institution. I see a comment coming in from Lewis. Let's see if I want to get to it now or in a second. Yes,
Don't
Southeast Asia.
later.
Yes, that sounds great. We can get to that later, Lewis. R2s are also research intensive, but not quite as intensive. So you typically have to produce 2 to 3 publications a year. You don't necessarily have the grant requirements. You don't have to be doing NIH grants, for example, to get tenure and promotion. And they're about equally distributed. They're about half, 30 to 30 R1 and R2s. There are also a growing amount of other types of institutions. There's doctoral and professional universities, which is yellow, and master's level universities. Now you're thinking, what is a doctoral program doing at a master's level university? Well, remember, this is Carnegie classification. So a university can have doctoral programs and still be master's level because they don't have very many of them. That's the big difference. At a master's level institution, the counselor ed doctoral program may be the only one, you know, or maybe a couple, but not many. And so the major difference here has to do with the number of programs, A, and the number of doctoral graduates, therefore, B, but also the amount of grant money the program brings in, which also plays a role in Carnegie classification. Okay. I'm going to show you another graphic, which is important to show you the difference between 2013 to 2018. Now, remember in 2013, you had this really important marker for counselor ed, which was this requirement for core faculty to possess doctorates from counselor education programs, right? So you can expect, following that there would be a increased number of doctoral programs in counseling in order, you know, to meet that need. And sure enough, there has been an increased amount of programs since 2013. In the last 5 years, we've had quite a growth, particularly notice the growth in master's level doctoral programs. There's been somewhat of a growth in R1 and R2s. You can see that there, the number of programs. But masters went from almost none in 2013 to now almost the same as doctoral and professional universities. And again, I think there's a reason for that. The reason is there's a need for doctoral level counselor educators, particularly in some regions of the country that are underserved. Examples of those regions would be the Western region, the North Atlantic region, and to some extent the Rocky Mountain region. And so you tend to see more of these master's level doctoral programs existing in master's level institutions. Okay, and that's important because it also plays into research preparation, because if you're at a master's level institution and you're a faculty member, most likely your requirement for tenure and promotion is fairly low in terms of pubs. You don't need to have 2 or 3 a year. You may need to have 2 or 3 or 4 period when you go up. Most of the criteria for your tenure and promotion may be based on things like teaching quality. And so at these institutions, you can imagine that the training is going to be more focused on teaching quality than research. This is important because you tend to see the argument around producing leaders particularly emerge from programs that aren't research institutions, because there's an interest in developing leaders, because we can't develop you as a high-level researcher. We don't have the resources, but we can develop you as a leader. And so I think for good reason, there's a need to consider doctoral programs as being leadership pipelines, not just research pipelines. Okay, let's talk about the current state of doctoral education in terms of the graduates, where they go. So this was a study that came out in 2013 in a book. There's a nice book that's worth reading that's very comprehensive by Schweiger and colleagues. About 50% of doctoral graduates go into academia. It is not 100%. There is a myth that we only produce faculty members in counselor ed doctoral programs, and that is not the case. About 50% go into full-time jobs in academia, okay? And you see, therefore, about half of doctoral students in your cohort, if you're currently a doctoral student or, you know, across the country, will go into different kinds of professional endeavors afterwards. About a third will go into higher ed or student affairs. So that's anything from administration related to higher ed, or it could be working in a college counseling center, for example. About 21% go into P through 12 education or continue there, and they use their doctoral degree to get like more pay for what they do, or maybe get a leadership role, such as being like the administrator of a school counseling program for a district. 20% go into agency practice. And again, this is where leadership becomes interesting, because like P through 12 education, you can imagine a doctoral level practitioner having potentially more leadership opportunities, or there being maybe that's part of the reason why they went into counselor ed programs. And then 18% go into private practice. Note that this number is the lowest. And as I've talked about before, that really counselor education programs don't tend to train practitioners. In fact, it's very rare in counselor ed programs to have extensive training in counseling. And so if you're someone who's already a clinician and you want to continue to do that, getting a doctorate in counselor ed perhaps isn't the best route to go, because it's not going to help you with, for example, reimbursement rate. You don't get able to bill at a higher rate for a doctorate like you would with psychology. And in addition to that, you know, you're taking a time away from your practice, and you probably have student loan debt by the end of it. So you're making that investment without a whole lot of return on it from a business standpoint if you're someone who's in private practice. Now, one of the interesting things about the current state of doctoral education is there are concerns about research identity and competence because it's not uniform. And I've talked about some of the factors that play into this. One has to do with Carnegie classification, faculty activities, and their ability to mentor students in high quality research. There are other things that play into this as well, in terms of whether or not a student comes out and sees themselves as a researcher. You know, they view themselves as fundamentally a researcher. And the first thing is that most master's level students do not go into master's level programs because they want to become researchers. They don't. You know, most master's level students go into master's level programs because they want to become practitioners. And that's important because there's a huge disconnect therefore between master's and doctoral level. And you can have a lot of students enter into doctoral study thinking they may be interested in research, but they're not really inclined that way. That wasn't fundamentally why they entered the counseling profession in the first place. And so for that reason, that can be a barrier for some people. In addition to that, I think we've done a nice job in counselor ed at trying to recruit students who come from underrepresented backgrounds and diverse backgrounds. Some of those students are very interested in research, but the institution may not be able to support their interests. I hear this a lot from doctoral students in counselor education, that they have this interest in researching a specific area related to, for example, a multicultural topic, but they don't have faculty in the institution who know much about that, and so they can't support it. And so it discourages research identity. And that's, I think, one of the problems we have, which is we have a greater representation of doctoral students from underrepresented backgrounds than we have faculty who are from underrepresented backgrounds. And that's a problem that we need to address. So there was a study by Hinkle and colleagues in 2014 that looked at motivations to pursue a doctorate in counselor education. Most people did enter with the intention to become a faculty member, and very few entered with the intention to become a clinical leader or school counseling leader. That's interesting. There's a small study that's had an N of 35 in it. But it's important for us to mention here that a lot of students who enter into doctoral programs do understand that it's an entry into potential, they're basically interested in becoming a faculty. Notice though, it's only 2/3. So again, 1/3 do not go into doctoral programs to become a faculty member. And so the question that I want to kind of work through with you following all this is, some of you, some professors want to be researchers, but a lot don't. And so how do you do research or get involved with research if that's not your passion? And what does leadership look like in relation to that? Is leadership something that you can really own and do research alongside it? And, you know, how do you balance those things? I think it's important because not every counselor educator is a researcher and not every counselor educator is a leader, but there are ways that you can merge both. All right, so I'm going to talk next about the scholar leader model, giving you a lot of background to this, you know, into the scholar leader model. We're going to talk first about the counselor advocate scholar model, which came out in 2014 by Ratz and Peterson. And of course, Vong Ratz is a well-known author in the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies kind of realm. He helped to author those, the revision to those competencies. And the article in 2018 that I'm going to talk a lot about is really focused on the identity of counselors, the importance of being social change agents, and how do you train, therefore, students in master's level and doctoral level programs. So one of the criticisms of counseling at the moment, the counseling training, counselor education, is that it prepares people to basically provide school-based or office-based therapy without doing a whole lot of advocacy. And it's built on the intrapsychic language and discourse, meaning the individual's problems are, you know, are caused by internal stimuli and internal stuff, and you have to help them resolve that through fixing or resolving whatever they've got inside of them, rather than the environment around them is causing the problem, and you have to change the environment in order for things to get better. And of course, if you're familiar with the social justice counseling movement, you're aware that there's really a great focus on how do you get counselors to be advocating more, and how do you get them more trained in advocacy action steps and things like that. So in this model, there's this kind of interest in training counselors to become advocates and to use scholarship in order to advocate, and also to write based on their advocacy experiences. And so there's beginnings of this kind of integration between scholarship and leadership here, and leadership looking more like advocacy, which I think is appropriate, because if you look at the identity of counselors, and we're talking here not just mental health, but school counselors as well, we really have to see ourselves as social change agents. If you look at the beginnings of the counseling profession, it was always predicated on this idea that the person is capable of of developing in an optimal fashion if barriers are removed. And so you have to work on removing those barriers in order for a person to develop. What we've really been working from, and if you are interested in this, you can read some notable works by, I'm going to forget his name now. There's a book about mental health culture by James Hansen, that's worth reading. That is a large criticism of the way that counseling has adopted models from psychiatry and psychology, to Lewis's point earlier, that basically tend to work from more of a deficit model, a medical model of care that will diagnose and then treat the diagnosis in order to get reimbursement, or in a school counseling setting, will identify problems like ADHD and autism and work to rectify those or refer out. And so the advocacy part of that is missing. And the reason why the scholar advocate model, the counselor advocate scholar model, was developed by Ratz and colleagues, was essentially to address this and to help counselors have a framework for understanding their own professional orientation. It's important to note here that psychology once again plays a role in our beginning development of models. The Ratz model was actually an outgrowth of the University of Tennessee at Knoxville's counseling psych model, which was called the scientist practitioner advocate model. They changed, and they acknowledged that influence. So here is a graphic from the Ratz and Peterson book, which is worth reading if you haven't read it. It's an ACA publication. They identify counselor, advocate, and scholar as three different domains of professional work, basically. And notice the interaction between those domains. So counselor and advocate, counseling informs advocacy and advocacy informs counseling. But look at advocate and scholar as well. Advocacy informs scholarship and scholarship informs advocacy. and with counseling and scholarship. Counseling informs scholarship, and scholarship informs counseling. So the idea here is that those three things can be integrated into what we do, so that even master's level counselors can be advocating for their clients, reading, research about client needs and then advocating, and then also writing up the results of what they're doing in counseling and advocacy to advance scholarship. Now, I think that's an area that we really should be developing more, which is master's level practitioners who are able to do scholarship, because this model doesn't work at the master's level if you don't have master's level scholars. But I think, the model is a good one, which is trying to integrate these different aspects of identity. This one's kind of an interesting one, just to quickly review, because we talked about the Hansen model and concerns about the mental health culture that we're in. So you look at the top, the counselor advocate scholar model, that then determines the root of client problems, determines whether or not the issue is biologically or psychologically based, or environmentally based, right? Sociologically based. And then if it is, to explore attempt advocacy counseling, right? So in other words, to differentiate what the problems are. Not every problem is going to be an advocacy problem, to their point, right? But there will be a significant number of issues that occur that are advocacy issue related. Now, this is important because remember, the primary task of the doctoral level counseling professional is to prepare master's level professionals. So if you have this model for preparation as a doctoral level professional, it can help you in helping to prepare master's level students, and even doctoral level students who will then prepare their own master's level students, right? So we're looking at how do you get counselors in general a pipeline for more advocacy and more leadership. So I've talked about social justice advocacy a little bit and multicultural counseling competence. I also want to talk about professional leadership in just a second, which is similar but different, professional advocacy. So this is the scholar leader model that I think we're moving towards. I think it started in the 2009 standards, where they identified leadership as a specific outcome that could be useful for graduates, not just researchers and teachers. And if you look at the 2009 standards, of course, they included leadership and advocacy, one of those 5 doctoral level areas to address, which was also new in 2009. So the scholar leader model provides, you have to have a doctorate in counselor education. That's pretty clear from the 2009 standards on, in order to basically, be a, to be a counselor educator in a KCRIP accredited program. You have to come from a university-based program. So that's very similar. There's no labs that can do this. And graduates should be competent, I think, in the following areas, following what we've learned about the history of doctoral programs in counseling and these new models that are emerging about how counselors can identify and in terms of their own work. Conducting research, advocating for social justice, and leadership in the counseling profession. I think those 3 things are important and separate enough. Now, I'll mention here that conducting research doesn't necessarily have to happen in lab-based settings. And one of the criticisms of counseling is that it's a bit too insular, that we tend to, unfortunately, do a lot of research on ourselves and how we best train. But without focusing on the people we're working with, students, clients, etc., it all feels a bit flat. And so I think there is more of an interest over time, I've noticed, in how do you get people involved with doing actual research around vulnerable populations, people you're working with, not just training. Both are important, don't get me wrong. But I think if we're going to develop a scholar leader model formally, it doesn't have to be scientist leader, right? We don't have to have labs, but we do have to have a way of doing more research that is more focused on vulnerable populations. And a good example of this would be action research in the forms of participatory action research. So for example, going into communities, seeing what they need and working to empower those communities and doing research that empowers those communities. That's a very useful model for counseling research, because that fits with this idea of us being advocates. So I think we're going to hopefully start seeing more of that focus in programs. There are already programs that are doing some of this in terms of how you get more involved in research and in communities. I'm going to talk next about my experiences. Let me see how we're doing on time here. We're right at time. But I wanted to at least mention a few things, since you had asked about my experiences, about why I think this model makes sense for us based on how I have seen my own scholarship and leadership go. First, I think we have a need for leaders with advocacy skills. So when I have worked as a leader in regional organizations like the Western region, for example, if you have an underrepresented region, there's often a need for advocacy with the larger national association, with what that region needs, what the members of that region need. In addition to that, at the state level, some states have major needs in terms of, not just professional membership, increasing numbers, which are always low. I mean, historically, only about 10% of counselors join their organizations, which is very concerning. But things like, getting onto healthcare panels, making sure that school counselors aren't being cut, all of those things are really important to be involved with. And that all requires advocacy. So if you're going to be a leader in the counseling profession, I think you need to be able to advocate, you need to have those skills. In addition, I think there's a need for scholars with leadership skills. All of my research has been with teams. Very little of my research has been done in a vacuum, just me working alone in an office somewhere. And I think that maybe that's part of the reason for that is because I'm very team oriented. But I also think that research is best done in teams. And so in order to be an effective scholar, I do think you need to be able to lead teams at times. And by that, be able to organize a team, be able to identify what each team member is doing, have each team member's strengths be brought up and used as part of the research. All those things are really important functions of scholarship, and things that you aren't necessarily well trained in a lot of doctoral programs today, because the dissertation is a solo venture primarily. And many students don't get a lot of experience doing team-based research projects in doctoral programs. And I think that's a model we could be looking at, is how do you train students to develop more leadership skills around scholarship? So leading teams of, and maybe taking turns in leading, research discussions and things like that, and research projects. In addition, when I've done work on editorial boards, that is entirely a leadership endeavor, in that you have to organize the people who are going to review the manuscript. You have to make sure that that's turned back into a certain amount of time. You also have to give quite difficult feedback to people and develop it in a kind way so that they can understand why, for example, the manuscript is rejected and what the rationale is. And you also have to be thoughtful about what the goals and objectives of the journal are, and work with the other editors to make sure that the kind of manuscripts you're publishing reflect the goals of the journal. All of that is leadership. So I think if you're going to do editorial work, again, leadership is a requirement. Book writing is something that I've also had the opportunity to have a foray into. And if you do any edited book work, that is entirely an organizational leadership challenge, in that you have to recruit people with very different writing styles, not just different expertise, and get them to be writing in a consistent way, and getting a book together that reads well. And that, again, requires leadership. So all that. The other thing I'll mention is I'm currently finishing up a book with a colleague, a dear colleague who needs more experience doing writing with books, who's interested in developing that competence. And so as a counselor educator, a lot of the work you do is mentoring. And mentoring is another form of leadership, right? That in scholarship is entirely important, because some people do need some mentorship in order to develop as scholars. So I think there's a need to train doctoral students, not just in research competencies, but also in how to lead research. I think, last I'll speak about the need for integration. We talked a bit about this at the beginning today. There's a bit of a myth that leadership does not equate to research, and that leadership and scholarship detracts from research. You'll hear that a lot when you're an incoming faculty member, or when you're a doctoral student. They'll say, okay, make sure you don't do a lot of service in your first 7 years so you get tenure. You'll hear that from your department chair or head when you get hired. Well, the truth is, in my experience, if you're engaged in leadership endeavors, research opportunities will flow from that if you're deeply engaged, because there's always a need for data. There's always a need to move things forward, and often that's through research. And so if you're engaged, there are all kinds of opportunities that come out of that. Of course, you want to be careful. You don't want to just be doing leadership, because it will take away from research if you're not careful. But a balance is important. And I think the idea that new scholars should entirely move away from doing any kind of leadership is I think it's not quite it's just not right, because most of the experiences I've had with developing research teams have been through leadership opportunities that I've had. Then I've then formed these teams that have gone on to do research. So I think there's a nice kind of interplay that can happen between leadership and research. Okay. So I know you have questions for me. One of the questions I want to ask you all about as we have our processing time, and Gideon will also facilitate, is, how do you conceptualize doctoral counselor education, right? What is the way in which it makes sense to you? And is the scholar leader model something that resonates with you or not? I'd be interested to hear from you about that. But I'm going to stop talking now and have a discussion with you all about this.
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I want to go back to my Oregon State days, because the things that really, we did an on-campus PhD, just to note that. And the things that I think I came away from OSU with that were really important were, number one, research. And that the research that we were allowed to do was pretty open, so that we could really challenge our own interests. But also a background in educational psychology, which was actually taught by the education department. And I came away with a lot of good pedagogical strategies and skills that really enhanced my teaching abilities and changed the way that I thought about interactions in the classes. I think that without that, you're not going to have really effective scholar instructors in counselor education at the master's level or at the doctoral level. There was another piece of it that was, I think, really important, and that was consultation. It was not heavily emphasized, but there was enough there to be able to wrap some skills around myself, and that's been my real end game as a scholar, is that becoming an international consultant requires a set of diplomatic skills, listening skills, and at the same time some good research and consultation advisement skills, because it's real easy to lose an audience or to lose colleagues in an international setting unless you have that ability to be able to sit back when you need to sit back and assert yourself when you assert yourself, and to have adequate resources going in and the ability to reach out and get those as you go along the way. I can't imagine going through a doctoral program in counselor ed without those pieces. I already had the clinical skills coming in, and so I think I got into the program because of my counseling skills. They made us do tapes, and I did a multiple personality and a personality disorder person. And the chair of the department turned around to everybody and said, "Yeah, he's got a psychology master's degree, but we got to have this boy because he's got really good clinical skills." I don't think I'd have gotten into the program without it. But the clinical skills were lacking in most of the other doctoral students at any real depth level. And that piece improved with them. And I think if it had been even more emphasized, it would have improved even better and had more effective outcomes for other doctoral students. It was nice to keep my hand in it, but I didn't really learn anything new at Oregon State that was even close to the clinical skills I already had. I'll let this go, let somebody else jump in.
I'll jump in here and just kind of throw out the observation. I think one of the pieces that you mentioned, Dr. Field, was this idea. I mean, really, you pointed to this more expansive understanding of leadership that's not necessarily some like association level position. It's not necessarily going to be the chair of a program per se, but really expanding our understanding of leadership. And so I suppose I just want to hone in on and kind of throw the sage on the stage for a little bit and ask something that you mentioned early on, which was without the sort of national structure of having labs that have been around for decades, I suppose I'm wondering, how do you think we could, in counselor ed at the doc level, develop researchers in the absence of those lab structures? That makes sense?
Yeah, I think that what we've done in the past is we focused on so labs are all about, let me back up a little bit. The reason we don't have labs is because we don't get huge grants, and we don't get huge grants because we're written out of grant. You know, the NIH does not really identify counselor education as, you know, as a respected discipline that would be, you know, that would look good on an NIH bio sketch. And the reason that labs are useful is because of access, right? Because then you have access to participants, to a sample, and you can do some experiments, you can do some studies. In the absence of that, counselor education has leaned on what they have access to, which is master's level students. So you see a lot of studies coming out about how to train master's level students, and perhaps appropriately so. It's more rare to see doctoral students doing research in the community. And I think that there's a huge opportunity for that, because a lot of programs could have already have students who are serving the community in different sites. So if there was more collaboration between sites in the community and the counselor education program, and getting doctoral students to be doing more participatory action research and things like that, that would actually be a nice model, I think, for us. And again, some universities are doing that already. I don't think it's feasible to expect us to develop labs. I just don't see it happening because the grant money's not there.
Yeah.
And sorry, hi everyone. So I think, and I agree with that point. I think there's a strong perspective with what we do with labs and what we would do in a different kind of research approach. Like, I would also be someone who's an advocate for, like, perhaps research teams really center your work around a specific agenda. So that way it does give you, or a collective, like I have this, it's funny because like some of my work is transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary. So I tend to work also with scholars in education and who work with the P through 12 system and really focus on curriculum and pedagogy. So in some way, sometimes it's so funny because like there's one who like invited me and she's like, you know, we're gonna have this collective, and I was like, what? Like, so sometimes that happens, right? Is that sometimes we center ourselves around research teams and collectives that are still resulting in the production of really good scholarship, both conceptually and empirically. I think sadly, I think what happens is, especially with so much of where the barriers hold us up in terms of a profession and what we do with external funding, so much of what we do belongs with, like, should be externally funded. And that's the sad part, because, and I think about Dr. Field, what you were saying with what earlier, like that so much of what we bring in with our doc students, there's a lot of capital and knowledge, and I don't think we always have the most effective way of using that capital and knowledge, especially when it's like clinical or practitioner capital, because that kind of knowledge base is very helpful when you think about how that knowledge builds into community-based practices, community-based research initiatives, and even when you think about developing an entire program that can actually be externally funded through NIH, through NIMH, Department of Labor, anything that could be at the national or large scale funding. So I think that's the struggle, is that we run into this issue of sometimes maybe it's part of like shifting our perspective and trying to expand and say, we can do these things. We just have to create create the argument and buy-in that we can do these things and we have the expertise to do it. I'm thinking about Gideon's question with how do we extend and create stronger researchers and scholars? I mean, and this brings me back to Dr. Field, your point about which, you know, it's funny now because I feel like you're preaching to the choir. So it's just like, because I'm like resonating with all these like amazing things, because this is also the belief system that I really grew up with was, you know, being told that leadership and leadership and service did not matter. And instead I said, I'm going to refute that and I'm still going to do it. So, and actually that ended up making me feel much more grounded in my scholarship and research. But the reality is, I think what happens too, when we're trying to create more effective scholars and researchers in doctoral education, I think, so maybe sometimes we don't have necessarily the capacity, recognizing that we have different Carnegie classifications and supports across all of our institutions that house our doctoral programs. What I think too is, for some of our doc students, what I remember telling one of our doc students, okay, it's clear that you have a passion. It's clear that you have a mark that you want to make on this profession. So I want you to run with that. And I want you to make sure to please do not wait for faculty to bring you onto their project, because you should be leading one right now. And you should think about like what kind of empirical study or scholarly project that you want to produce, and not just necessarily wait for a faculty member to bring you on, because, and bear with me, and this is like sort of my response to your question, and this is like a tangential response, but I think it also says something when, to me, I tell our doc students this, that I've seen people with 20 journal article publications who have struggled getting jobs or jobs that they want because their identity is not clear. And I think that comes back to what you were saying, as the scholarship and leadership are not mutually exclusive roles. They are very much more integrated than we think they are. And so if I can't figure out, okay, I don't know what your work ethic is like, I don't know who you are, I have no idea what your identity is or who you're about or what you're about, then maybe that's not, it's not helpful, especially as we think about job marketability, when, say, if perhaps counselor doc students want to pursue a faculty position at a later point.
That's such a great point, Christian. I want to add to what you're saying, or at least maybe to respond to what you're saying, that, you know, when Christian mentioned this great example of a person who have 20 publications and still have difficulty finding a job because they don't have an identity, they don't have a grounding sense of who they are professionally. And you know, I know some of you asked about my neuroscience background, you know, because if most people say Tom Field, oh yeah, he's the neuro guy, you know, you kind of get known for something. The reason why that's important for me to bring up is because all of that research happened within a community of people, right? That I basically found a community of people over time who had this similar interest, and we started doing research together. And so the reason I bring that up is that happened through leadership, right? I met people through doing service and leadership that I then did research with. And if I had been very insular and just stayed in my office doing my own research, I may not have even got into neuroscience in the first place, you know what I mean? Or had this very different research trajectory. So I think, in other words, you have to go put yourself out there and meet people. And the part of the way you do that is through leadership and service, through meeting people that like interests. And so I think that's how you also develop an identity, is through leadership and through meeting people and figuring out, you know, where you fit. And I don't know if you know that. Maybe, Christian, you know, you've met students who do know that when they're a doctoral student, but it's not true for all doctoral students. Some doctoral students don't know who they are professionally until they go out there and try some things, meet some people, and, you know, make connections.
I have a reaction. I think that you're really accurate about the external funding being lacking, but what I see happening inside of the counseling field, particularly at the organizational level, is a decrease in any kind of support for scholarship or publication. ACA got rid of all of its journals that it possibly could, and went to mostly counseling and development as their primary journal. And what it does is it cuts out people who can't get external funding from being able to use counseling circles to publish, which both cuts out or at least makes it difficult leading a team of students who don't have a publication record and who can't put themselves out there in front of a major psychology journal. And it diminishes the amount of publishable space for people who don't have otherwise funding, to be able to talk to other counselors about important research results. I find this to be, I'm going to try to be careful with my language, foolish on the part of the counseling community to become so mercenary that the ACA is rolling in money but can't afford to fund publishing sources that they used to fund that were real critical to talking about major issues, ethical research, international research, anything that doesn't fit with their primary agenda for counselor education and development.
Yeah, it's a really interesting comment around venues. That so there's this kind of interesting dynamic in counseling, which is that there are a lot of counselor education programs. So there are about 400 counselor education, CACREP accredited counselor education programs. And you'd think that at least they can have at least 3 or 4 or 5 faculty in each of those programs. There's a lot of faculty members who are seeking to publish. And what the truth is, a lot of the journals in counseling don't have high impact factors. Well, let me explain what an impact factor is if you're not familiar. But basically, most journals have this: if you are cited a lot and if you're cited in certain journals, you get a higher impact factor. It's basically how much weight does this publication have. We have a pretty low impact. In fact, very few journals even have an impact factor in counseling. JCD, Journal of Counseling Development, does have one, but it's still less than 2. It's a fairly low impact factor. Yet, it's very hard to get published in JCD. And the reason is because we have a lot of faculty members who are trying to produce research and publish in JCD. And therefore, the acceptance rate is low in a lot of counseling journals because this has to do with volume. And it's funny because I've had peers who've said, it was a lot easier to publish in other venues outside of counseling, even though it has higher impact factors. It has to do with the amount of volume. I think the reason this is an important piece to mention is that I also wanted to add to what Lewis is saying, that students also need to know that there are other venues to publishing at the beginning that are important. When I started publishing, my initial publications were in state-level journals. The Virginia Counselors Association had a journal that I would publish in. And it was a good experience for me to understand the editorial process. And also, a lot of, basically everyone who's a member of the state organization got a copy of that journal. And so it was good dissemination of certain information. And so you don't have to be publishing nationally at the beginning, to be making an impact and to start developing a research identity. Because if you just, and this is the thing that's difficult about getting a job as a faculty, there is this focus on, okay, if you have these national pubs, when you come out of a doc program, you're more marketable. But as Lewis is saying, that's hard because even as a faculty member, it can take years sometimes to get an article published. And if you're a doc student, you don't have years, so I think you have to be kind to yourself and realize that you're not going to get a JCD article published as a doc student unless you're incredibly lucky. Most students, doctoral students, if you're publishing in some of the online journals like the Professional Counsel, which by the way also has become more competitive, the journals like that are ones to look into in addition to state-level journals at the beginning. And also, to be asking yourself about who your audience is. That's something that I have found that a lot of new counselor educators need help with. Like, we see things through our own kind of lens, right? We look at our article and like, this is a brilliant article. Everyone's going to love this. This journal is going to love this. But you have to ask yourself a question like, who is their readership? What is their readership going to be interested in? So I've sent articles, I'll be honest, I'll use myself as an example. I've sent articles that I thought were great, that I sent to journals that had a readership that would have no interest in my article, but I hadn't thought about it that way, right? So I was like, this is a great article, they'll publish it. But you have to think about it that way too, which is just like anything, it's fit, it's match, right? Just like your search for faculty jobs, it has to be a good fit. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Same thing, fit matters. So that's the other thing as a new researcher, you have to be okay with, which is this idea of, if I have a certain interest, I'll give you a very pertinent example of this, and I'll be quiet. But neuroscience is not an interest to all counselors. It's not. So the idea that I'm going to get a gazillion articles published in JCD is not going to happen on neuroscience. It's not, because most counselors don't really care too much about neuroscience. So you have to be realistic, right? And figure out, well, what is a publication venue that I can use that would be useful, right? That would advance the field. So in other words, you have to take ego out of it in this idea of, I'm going to get this JCD publication, and you have to think about what actually helps people, right? What helps the community.
Amazing. Let me just bring some awareness to the time. We probably have opportunity for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. And I'm wondering, I know I saw Daniel and Nandini unmute themselves, so I don't know if you wanted to jump in here and offer some last comments.
Yeah, I just have a comment. So the scholar leadership model, fits well, but because the medical model is missing the advocacy component, which is so much a part of our identity, for as long as we are beholden to the medical model for reimbursement, we'll always be second-class providers. The comment that Dr. Field just made about neuroscience not being an area of interest for many counselors, maybe that's the missing piece, because maybe that will make us on par with medical providers.
I don't know. All right, so I hear what you're saying, Nandini. I do, which is that counselors tend to get the shaft, in the professional space. We're seen as people who have less science to back up what we do. We're more fruity. I could go on, right? Mm-hmm. I think in general, we shouldn't try to do what other professions do well better. That's not going to work for us. The idea of us being, being able to better integrate neuroscience, we're never going to be able to do it as well as other professions do it. I mean, that's not our focus. I think what we need, I think instead, one of the reasons why I really believe that counseling needs to further immerse itself into the idea of doing more action research and involvement in communities is because I think that's where counseling identity makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. I think that's different from a social work identity. Social work identity tends to be more working within systems, whereas we're empowering people within mm-hmm. systems.
Yeah, but I do think the neuroscience model is capable of promoting the wellness model, which is basically what we are based on. And so neuroscience doesn't necessarily have to promote the medical model. It promotes the wellness model, and that's the missing component here. That, it's the wellness model that is all la-di-da. And so yes. If we have neuroscience to back that up, then we're on par.
Well, again, how can I say this? All right, this is going to sound entirely off the beaten path, but just hang in there with me. We're never going to be on par. And the reason is because to get on par, we have to get behind the medical model. In other words, we have to be great at diagnosing and great at treating. And I don't think we are. I don't think we are that way trained. I don't think we should be. I do think, to your point about wellness, that there are things we can do for prevention that would help us to be differentiated. In fact, I talk a lot about the importance of getting counselors trained in primary care settings and to be doing things like, assessment of sleep and assessment of physical activity and things like that, because of course those things do lead to pronounced changes with things like BDNF and cortisol, and I won't go down that train, but the reason that we don't do that as much is because it requires faculty to be usually very involved in communities. You can't just place a student in a primary care setting if you've never had contact with that setting. You have to be working there already, or you have to have contacts who are working there, because those settings are highly medicalized. So, it's that kind of thing that, again, leadership plays a role in. And then scholarship plays a role in, we need more studies that show that counselors can be effective in those settings doing certain interventions. I think that's where we can differentiate ourselves professionally, rather than seeking to be on par, because I don't know if we're ever going to get there.
So again, I think
I know we're
doing this webinar was really valuable for me from this point of view. My last 2 articles have been published internationally after several tries at APA journals, ACA journals, and invitations to publish professionally, or through professional journals that wanted money, published both internationally, and was rather discouraged by that. But what I'm coming to listening to all this is how we don't really have a word for it. Ethnocentric doesn't fit. United States centric we are about the whole idea of being scholars, because publishing internationally, both of the articles are really widely read, not by any Americans. And I've been waiting to see which American's actually going to read some of this stuff, but I'm being read really strongly in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Southeast Asia, Africa, and suddenly it dawns on me during the webinar, that's okay. Maybe I should continue to publish internationally, because it was certainly much easier to get in those pubs, and they're being really well read, just not in the community that I expected.
Well, I think that's a good point, Lewis, which is, it sounds to me like your research also comes out of the work you've done within those communities. And so, of course, those communities will be more interested in reading it than other communities. And that's true in general with research, which is the kinds of communities that you're involved with will be most interested in the results of your work.
Amazing. Well, let me just say, I know that we've arrived at our time, so let me just close us out here and offer up some closing comments. Dr. Field, thank you for putting this together, sharing this space, and thank you everyone here for just jumping right in and being such an attuned, responsive group. And hopefully too, you have a clear sense that even though this is the first time that we've all gathered together, this shouldn't be the end of the conversation, but these conversations will continue as we go forward. So there's a couple of closing pieces here by way of follow-up. I know Dr. Field mentioned a number of articles. I'll be sure to send an email to you all, just referencing what those articles are, so you have a clear sort of touchstone to go back to those for your own interest, and perhaps Saturday morning reading. And then I'll also be sending out a link to a survey. Your feedback is really important. If you've attended a webinar before, you know that this is itself sort of amorphous, moving sort of process. So we welcome any sort of feedback that you have to really make these more robust and more engaging as we go forward, and hope disseminate these for free use across the counseling world. We have a couple of webinars lined up for the next quarter or so you can check those out on the website, which I'll also send forward in an email. But without further ado, thank you all for being here. I'm going to throw this back to Dr. Field for any closing remarks or reflections.
No, I think you summarized that very well, Gideon, and it was really a pleasure to talk with you all today. And I hope that it was, that you took something away that would be helpful to you. I don't pretend to be an expert on everything or to know everything, but if you took something away, that's what matters. And, the most important thing to me is that you feel empowered to do research and leadership and know that's going to work together well, So.
Amazing. Thank you all. Have a great Saturday. Have a great weekend. I'll see you next time. Bye, y'all.
Bye. Thank you.